So we're going to start with Luffy and go through his character development arc. Spoilers for One Piece if you haven't made it through most of the series, especially to the time skip or beyond the time skip. But I'm sorry, it's a very fundamental part of his character development arc. So we start with dramatic need. His dramatic need is very, well, obvious and straightforward. It plays in very much into his nature in that he is unlike the other example, which is Chihiro from Spirited Away. He is a very extroverted, very boisterous, outgoing character, and so his dramatic need plays into his nature, his attitude, and his point of view. And it is very plain and simple. It is that he wants to be the Pirate King. He wants to find One Piece, and he wants to be the Pirate King. And he's not a negative character, and he's not an antagonist in any way. But he still wants to be a pirate, and he wants to be the Pirate King. He's not necessarily willing to do anything to get it, but he has a clear focus and a clear line of direction, a path that he's moving forward towards a goal. But in his moving forward towards his goals, he also is acquiring a level of friendship and camaraderie. That is also a part of his dramatic need, but it's still very straightforward. Point of view. For the most part, his point of view is very positive. He cares about people. He's not negative. Even though he's a pirate, as we were saying before, he has a very positive outlook on the world. And even though he admired pirates at a very young age, and even though those pirates that he looked up to may or may not be necessarily good, they weren't truly bad people. They were sort of ambiguous in their nature. This didn't have a negative effect on him as he developed into a full-fledged character as an adult. But for him, his point of view is still very optimistic. It is very upbeat and very forward-thinking, very progressive. And even though he gets into fights and very negative situations, he's often more willing to try to negotiate and befriend someone than fight them. And even though it doesn't always work out for him, he still stays fairly positive even afterwards. And this is a very interesting character aspect. To Luffy, the world is a wide open vista for exploration, an endless world to be explored with new friends and companions to be made. And it's just the world itself it's adventure personified. So then we go to attitude. Luffy's attitude plays into the way that he sees the world. His point of view is upbeat and wholehearted. His spirit of adventure, he is still very, he's silly and he's goofy and he doesn't take anything too serious, but just serious enough that it doesn't get him killed, or it doesn't hurt anyone else, any of his friends. But of course, all of this comes into play with his attitude. His point of view definitely comes into play more as he reaches his dramatic change. But for the most part, for the majority of the series, up to the time skip, he is a very carefree, very upbeat, positive, and boisterous, very charismatic character. And you could say he's very extroverted. And he has a way of rubbing off on people in a very positive way and influencing them in a very positive way. And he leaves a very lasting impression. Because of that, people often gravitate towards him, and he's able to extract goodness out of people, even when sometimes they seem to be the worst. Okay, so this would be a good point where we're actually going to get into spoilers. So again, if you haven't made it to the time skip in the series, then you probably don't want to go beyond this point. Or be warned, there are major spoilers. Okay, so now we go to the change. Luffy actually has a very clear and definite change. A dramatic change. Up to this point, Luffy was more so what I would consider a blank slate character. And by that I mean he was created in order to appeal to a very wide audience. And in order to do that, you make it so that your character doesn't really change too much from arc to arc. He doesn't evolve as a person. But if you actually pay attention to the entire pre-time skip story, all of the characters around him, all of his friends, actually evolve and their personalities are fleshed out a lot. Not just their backgrounds, but their actual personalities. They're more defined than he is. So, then we come into the Marineford arc, which is the second to last part in what's considered the first half of One Piece. In this story, Luffy is trying to save Ace, his brother, from being executed. And he actually spends a large chunk of the story trying to reach him and then when he finally does reach him, there's a large-scale war between many of the most powerful characters in the series up to that point. But in the end, after all of that effort, he actually doesn't succeed. He's not able to save Ace. He actually sees him die. He watches him die, and it fills him with despair and anger and sadness and every emotion. And because he couldn't prevent it, as hard as he tried, he still couldn't prevent it from happening as much as he wanted. And at that point is when the character Luffy changes. This is his dramatic change because his seemingly unadulterated world has now become tainted. He carries a burden, now a level of guilt over feeling like he failed. He wasn't strong enough and he wasn't fast enough to help. And so he initially carries this around with him. And even though he eventually, as the story progresses beyond this arc and into the time skip, he's able to move past these feelings of initial guilt, it still sits with him. And he literally wears a scar on his chest to remind him of his failings. Because up to this point, he had never failed. Not really. He had never really failed. He had been faced with obstacles, some that seemed impossible, but he still triumphed over them in the end, somehow, either through his own will or with the help of his friends. And you can tell he still reflects on it, and the change is more permanent in that after the time skip, Luffy is a bit more serious. He's more introspective. He's still very upbeat and outgoing and silly, but there's a tonal shift in him and the way that he approaches the world. And he's a little more hesitant or just cautious in general. But he's definitely more serious. And from this point on in the story, he is basically at the same level of character development with all of his crewmates. Now everyone is fully fleshed out and real, as if they were actual people. And he's no longer just a caricature. He is a real personality. So now we go to background. So Luffy's background is very public and private, in that he is known globally as a pirate, and he's also a devil fruit user, and most people know how his power set works. And it's a very public background. They've seen his history play out through most of the world. They've watched his exploits and his adventures, and they've seen the results of them. And while it may not all be generally seen as negative, he's still a pirate, and so the Marines still see him as an enemy. And this plays into his very private background, because Luffy the pirate is related to a Marine, Garp, his grandfather, a high-ranking Marine. And this is quite possibly one of the most interesting backgrounds, because what this actually tells readers is that this is not just a background, but a conflict, which is something that sometimes you can add to the character development list, but you don't have to, because it usually plays into one of those previous aspects. A lot of times it comes in at the background. But it is a conflict, because we know that later down the line, at some point in the story, it can only lead to the two of them clashing, because they're on either side of the law. So they'll have to face off against each other, blood against blood. And It's an inevitability, but it helps to flesh out his character more. It gives him more depth. It makes him more interesting and more well-rounded and more human and more realistic. And it also allows the creator the ability to further develop future stories, to expand upon things later on down the line. It's an open door, it's an opportunity. And that's really what all of these are. Adding this to your character allows for opportunity, allows you to expand the character, not just the character, but the story in many ways, and make it a better experience for readers. Okay, well, hopefully this was helpful in some way. And there is another video where we talk about a different character with an equally interesting development arc. And hopefully you'll enjoy that one as well. Okay, well, thank you for watching, and thank you for listening. Bye. So we're going to start with Luffy and go through his character development arc. Spoilers for One Piece if you